Okay, so our next presenter, we have Hoeyun on the unequal impact of COVID-19.
All right. Good morning. I'm Hoeyun, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa. So this study is about how human mobility has changed during the pandemic and how those changes are associated with social vulnerability. So apparently, COVID-19 pandemic affected everybody, but not equally. So there are more cases and deaths in certain groups of people. Of course, there can be many different factors contributing to such health inequities, but in this study, we focus on human mobility because mobility is something that is directly connected to the exposure to the virus. So many previous studies already found disparities in human mobility changes during the pandemic. So for example, this chart on the left, it shows that socioeconomic factors affect both COVID-19 situation and human mobility, and also COVID-19 pandemic and human mobility, they are affecting each other at the same time. Also, these figures on the right, they are showing how human mobility has changed during the pandemic and how those changes are different by different levels of socioeconomic status. So these findings from the previous studies raise a question if human mobility can be used as a proxy of social vulnerability during the pandemic. And here, social vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of groups of people to the impact of disasters. And from the previous studies, I could define two major research gaps. So first one is about mobility measure. So if we could use mobility as a proxy of social vulnerability, then how can we capture the complexity of mobility? So most of the mobility measures used in the previous studies are having static notions such as frequency of traveling or home dwelling time, but there is a need of using mobility measure that capture the complexity of mobility, such as connectedness between places. And another gap is about spatial heterogeneity. So this figure is about spatial distribution of different levels of social vulnerability. So it varies a lot across space. So we can imagine there might be spatial variations in the relationship between human mobility and social vulnerability as well, but we are not fully understanding those local associations. So these are research questions and corresponding goals of this study. So first, we develop network-based mobility measures to capture the complexity of human mobility data. Also, we compute the changes in mobility behaviors to see how unequally COVID-19 has affected human mobility. And lastly, we identify local associations between mobility changes and social vulnerability to see if there are any spatial variations in their association. So this is our workflow. First, we develop a mobility measure and process human mobility data. We use census tract level. So we estimate the changes in human mobility for each tract, and then combining social vulnerability level for each tract, we capture the local associations between mobility changes and social vulnerability. So we compare two different periods. So for pre-pandemic period, we use January and February of 2020. And for lockdown period, we use April and May of 2020. And we analyze the data by tract level. So we use census tracts in two most populated metropolitan statistical areas in the US, so which are New York and LA. And data sources. So for mobility data, we use mobile phone location data provided by SafeGraph. So this data give us a daily number of visitors between every pair of two tracks. And for social vulnerability data, we use social vulnerability index developed and provided by CDC. So this index is a combination of many different factors, such as socioeconomic status, age, disability, household composition, minority status and language, house type, and the availability of transportation. And this is how we estimate the changes in human mobility. So first, we develop a new measure of outflow-weighted radius of gyration, OWRG in short. So this measures the spatial range of human mobility for each origin track. And this is actually a simple modification of the original radius of gyration, which is basically a standard deviation of distances between the location of each destination and the mean center of all destinations. But the only difference of our measure is that we use outflow-weighted mean center instead of the mean center. So by using this outflow-weighted mean center, we can avoid the bias that might be produced by very far destinations with only a few visitors, because mean center does not consider the volume of flows between places. So after we calculate this OWRG for each census tract and for each of two different periods, we subtract this mobility of the pre-pandemic period from the mobility of the lockdown period so that we can get the changes in mobility behaviors for each track. And to identify local associations between human mobility changes and social vulnerability, we use bivariate local indicators of spatial associations, bivariate LISA in short. So this method computes the statistical relationship between the value of one variable and the average of surrounding values of another value. So in our case, it captures if the social vulnerability of one track is surrounded by the high or low level of mobility changes. So it'll show spatial non-stationarity in the association between mobility changes and social vulnerability. So this map shows the result of mobility changes by track. So mobility changes here, the values are in kilometers. So for example, the purple, the greater than 0, it means the increase in human mobility. And the lightest green color, it means that there is no change or just slight reduction of mobility. And as the green color becomes darker, it means that there's more reduction of mobility. So we can see the map is overall green, but it varies a lot. And especially for these three highlighted regions, they have many tracks with purple or lighter green, which means that these areas experienced no change or just slight reduction or even increase in mobility during the pandemic. And these figures are about local associations between social vulnerability and human mobility changes. So since this is a bivariate analysis, there are 4 different clusters from high to low based on the level of each variable. And here I want to first mention that high and low level of mobility change, they are based on the mobility change values that I showed in the previous slide. So you can also find them from these histograms. So these histograms are showing the frequency of tracks by mobility change values for 2 different clusters, high in red and low in blue. So for example, high cluster, it means that it has high social vulnerability and the increase in mobility or just slight reduction of mobility. And on the other hand, this low cluster in blue, it means that those areas are having low social vulnerability and more reduction in mobility as well. So if you see the map, it's overall mostly blue and red. So we could find this general relationship that as people are more vulnerable to disasters, they could not reduce their mobility as much as people with low social vulnerability did during the pandemic. And especially these three highlighted regions, these are overlaps with these areas in the previous slides where mobility has reduced only a little or even increased. So these areas are mostly having high cluster, which means that they are also highly vulnerable to disasters. So this is, from this study, we could develop the mobility measure, which is outflow-weighted radius of gyration that estimate the changes in mobility behaviors. And using this measure, we could see how unequally human mobility has changed during the pandemic, and there are spatial variations in the association between those mobility changes and social vulnerability. And actually, this is a preliminary study of our project, so in the future, we will continue to develop network-based mobility measures and then evaluate which one works better for understanding these pandemic situations. And also, we are very interested in finding what makes those variations in the association between human mobility changes and social vulnerability. So we will expand our study areas to see if there's any common characteristics based on different characteristics of different areas. Yeah, this is all I have, and any feedbacks are welcome. All right. Thank you.